Morning all, and welcome to the VBA ESM webinar. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. We'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Andrew Cellini, State Building Surveyor with the VBA, and today we're here to talk about essential safety measures, or ESMs. The VBA's involvement in the statewide audit and the inappropriate use of combustible cladding has provided a valuable insight into documentation, construction and maintenance issues in buildings. A key element of the approach is to identify the type and standard of maintenance ESMs in these buildings. ESMs are vital to ensuring that occupants can be alerted to a fire event and evacuate the building quickly and safely, and the optimum operation of ESMs becomes even more critical when the building has combustible cladding that can accelerate fire spread in a building. Unfortunately, in addition to the widespread use of combustible cladding, the audit has revealed systematic issues of non-compliance with ESMs that range from inadequate design and approval, poor construction practices, a lack of documentation and a lack of a clear point of handover to owners, often resulting in substandard maintenance. The VBA are leading an ESM enhancement program with government regulators and industry stakeholders to deliver increased resources, awareness campaigns, education and training to improve competencies and build an evidence base for future reform. These presentations are one initiative of that program. In addition, many VBA and industry resources are currently being updated. We're in the process of updating the ESM maintenance manual that is available on the VBA website and details the requirements and parameters building owners must work within to meet regulatory obligations. The VBA recently published on the website a reference guide on the ESM responsibilities framework to assist in illustrating and clarifying the legislative obligations of all those with the responsibility for ESM compliance. There's currently a system-wide review of the Victorian building regulations underway, chaired by the Commissioner for Better Regulation, Anna Cronin, as well as the Australian Building Codes Board Confidence Report Team review of the national framework. This is a terrific opportunity to promote and implement legislative changes and other initiatives that have been identified via the ESM enhancement program. And we're keen to develop and promote the changes needed to improve ESM outcomes. Some of the issues we will cover today include the various roles and responsibilities, enforcement from the perspective of council and the private sector, and how it relates to the legislative requirements. It's important that practitioners, contractors, owners, regulators and authorities all play their part to ensure ESMs are appropriately designed, approved, constructed, maintained and audited, and provide for occupant safety for the entire life of the building. The session will run for approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. As we go along, I'd encourage you to type any questions you have into the Q&A box so that we can either answer during or at the end of the session. We will have Peter Jolly and MBS attending us or joining us at the end for the Q&A session as well. And I'd like to now introduce our first presenter, John Katajar, Senior Technical Advisor in the VBA's Technical and Regulation Division, to provide an ESM legislative overview. Thanks, John.
My name is John Katajar. I work for the VBA as the Senior Technical Advisor. I'll be presenting a brief overview of the regulatory provisions relating to maintenance of essential safety measures. The presentation is intended to cover a wide variety of skill level in the audience. My portion of the presentation will take about 12 minutes and questions will be answered at the end of all of the presentations. The following topics will be covered in my part of the presentation. What is an essential safety measure? Why maintain essential safety measures? Who is responsible for ESM maintenance? Owners' responsibilities, approved forms, and your ESM questions answered. What is an essential safety measure? An essential safety measure is a measure required under the Building Act or regulations for the safety of persons and includes the measures specified in Schedule 8 of the building regulations. These include measures such as emergency lights, exit signs, and fire detection systems and the like. Since the 1st of July 1994, ESMs were specified on occupancy permits and maintenance determinations. Occupancy permits and maintenance determinations which list ESMs must also specify the minimum level of maintenance for the ESMs listed. For pre-1994 buildings, ESMs must be maintained in a state which enables the ESM to fulfil its purpose. Why maintain ESMs? The underlying principle is community safety, and it's also to maintain the level of safety as it existed on the day that it was approved. ESM maintenance is a mandatory requirement for Class 1B to Class 9 buildings, and this requirement is mostly contained in Part 15 of the building regulations. ESM maintenance can also avoid potential enforcement action, which could be in the form of infringement notices or prosecution, where penalties of over $35,000 can apply to an individual and over $245,000 can apply to companies. Who is responsible for ESM maintenance? Part 15 of the building regulations contains two divisions. Division 1 relates to maintenance of essential safety measures. Under Division 1, the owner is responsible to maintain essential safety measures. Division 2 relates to maintenance of exits and paths of travel. Under Division 2, the occupier is responsible to maintain exits and paths of travel. Owner's responsibilities. Owners are required to take all reasonable steps to ensure that each ESM is operating and has been maintained in a state that enables the ESM to fulfill its purpose and has been inspected, tested and maintained in accordance with the Building Act and regulations. Owners are also required to keep maintenance records and make them available, and this includes a record of rectification of deficiencies. The flow on from this is that ESM contractors should be providing the owner with a copy of maintenance and rectification records. Approved forms. Approved ESM forms are available on the VBA website. The first of the approved ESM forms is a maintenance determination. This gets issued by the relevant building surveyor. A maintenance determination is issued if an essential safety measure is required to be provided or altered by a building permit that does not require an occupancy permit, or an emergency order or building order issued under Part 8 of the Act. The maintenance determination must specify the maintenance requirements that were provided or altered by the subject building work. The next of the approved ESM forms is a maintenance schedule. The maintenance schedule gets issued by a building surveyor. The maintenance schedule lists ESMs provided for a building in one consolidated location. This requires the building surveyor to list ESMs specified in a maintenance schedule, including their maintenance requirements. A maintenance schedule must be issued when a maintenance determination is issued or if an occupancy permit under Regulation 194 is issued. Alternatively, owners can engage a building surveyor to provide a maintenance schedule identifying all ESMs that exist for a building, including those not specified in an occupancy permit or maintenance determination. And these would be the pre-1994 measures that exist. This is particularly useful for owners of pre-1994 buildings, as ESMs are not listed on the occupancy permits for pre-1994 buildings. When listing ESMs in a maintenance schedule, the ESMs and maintenance requirements must not be changed from what's specified in the occupancy permit or maintenance determination. The next of the approved ESM forms is an annual essential safety measures report. This gets signed by the owner or the owner's agent. The annual essential safety measures report can be signed when the owner has taken all reasonable steps to ensure that all ESMs have been maintained in a state that enables them to fulfil their purpose, and ESMs have been inspected, tested, and maintained in accordance with the Building Act and regulations. Regulation 223 does not allow an annual essential safety measures report to be completed with conditions such as the following are required to be maintained. This would suggest that the ESMs have not been maintained. Doing so could lead to enforcement action such as infringement notices being issued. ESM deficiencies should be measured against the installation level of performance specified on the occupancy permit or maintenance determination. Your ESM questions answered. The following are some of the questions that the VBA have been requested to comment on. The first question relates to maintenance schedules. What does the building surveyor do when he or she is engaged to prepare a voluntary maintenance schedule at the request of an owner under Regulation 220 and the owner does not provide the documents specified in Regulation 219, being a copy of all maintenance determinations, maintenance schedules, and annual essential safety measure reports? As a maintenance schedule under Regulation 220 is a voluntary provision, the building surveyor should not provide the Regulation 220 maintenance schedule until the owner provides the documents required. The next question relates to maintenance schedules. When a building surveyor is preparing a maintenance schedule, Regulation 222 specifies that the ESMs must be listed in chronological order according to the date on which each ESM was required to be provided. How is this done for pre-1994 buildings? The reference to the date on which each ESM was required to be provided relates to the date of the occupancy permit or maintenance determination. For pre-1994 buildings, the ESMs are listed in the pre-1994 table within the maintenance schedule without a need for a specific date to be expressed. This slide shows a cut and paste of the pre-1994 table contained within the maintenance schedule. The information to be inserted within this table is to list the pre-1994 measures that exist for the building or place. The next question relates to maintenance schedules. Can a maintenance schedule be issued on one tenancy or sole occupancy unit within a large building, such as a shopping centre? Regulation 218 specifies that a maintenance schedule relates to a building or place of public entertainment. So in answer to this question, Regulation 218 requires the maintenance schedule to be issued on the building, being the entire building. The next question relates to annual essential safety measure reports. Can multiple different buildings or parts of buildings on the same allotment be specified on one annual essential safety measures report? Examples of this would be as follows: a multi-storey residential apartment building or a hospital site that contains multiple different buildings. If the building is a multi-storey residential apartment building, the annual essential safety measures report can be issued for combined parts of the building owned by separate entities, or an annual essential safety measures report can be issued for each part of the building in separate ownership. If the site is a hospital, for example, and it contains multiple separate annual essential safety, it contains multiple buildings on one site, then a separate annual essential safety measures report should apply for each separate building. Next question relates to who can carry out ESM inspection and maintenance functions. ESM inspection and maintenance functions should be undertaken by competent persons. Australian Standard 1851 defines a competent person as a person who is acquired through training, qualification, experience, or a combination of these, the knowledge and skill enabling them to correctly perform the required task. In addition, persons carrying out routine servicing of fire hose reel systems, fire hydrant systems, sprinkler systems, and air handling systems are required to be a licensed plumber whose licensing authorises the carrying out of routine servicing of these ESMs. So in conclusion, the principle behind ESM maintenance is community safety. Owners have a legal obligation to maintain ESMs, and occupiers are required to maintain exits and paths of travel. The annual Essential Safety Measures report is signed when all ESMs have been maintained as specified by the Act and regulations. This brings us to the end of my part of the presentation. Questions will be answered at the end of all of the presentations, or you can forward questions to technicalinquiry@vba.vic.gov.au, or you can phone through on 1300 815 127. I'll now hand you over to Andrew, who will introduce the next speaker. Thank you for your attendance.
Thanks, John. I now welcome Stephen Baxis, Municipal Building Surveyor, City of Melbourne, to present his experience with enforcement following the Neo200 Fire event. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just set up the presentation. Hopefully you can all see that now. So today I want to talk to you about essential safety measures from a municipal building surveyor's perspective and how their condition impacts on decisions that I need to make from time to time. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to talk about the Neo200 Fire. So whilst this presentation focuses on essential safety measures, I'm going to talk briefly about the fire for those who don't know about this particular event. So on the 4th of February in 2019 at 5:43 a.m, a general fire alarm triggered the alarm signalling unit for the building and notified the fire brigade to a fire at 200 Spencer Street in Melbourne. So the yellow arrow here shows the location of the fire. The fire started on level 22 of a 41-storey building. The fire caused damage from level 21 to level 27. So this photo was taken from level 27 looking down the building, and you can see Spencer Street below. The metal structure towards the top of the photo is an architectural fin which was clad in an ACP material with a 100% polyethylene core. This is where the fire started. This is level 22, apartment 09, on a balcony. It's believed that a cigarette ignited flammable items which were stored on the balcony and in turn ignited the ACP cladding. The image to the left, you can see an awning window about this position. I'm using my mouse, which is a bedroom window, was slightly ajar, and you can see the burnt fin to the right of it. The image to the right, you can see the balcony where the fire first started, and again you can see that the wall of that balcony was clad in ACP as well. So this is a situation on site. So the building was completely evacuated of its 1,100 occupants. The building suffered damage from level 21 to 27, which is mainly fire and water damage, and water damage from level 27 all the way down to level 14. The building also lost all power. So as the MBS, I'm responsible to ensure that the safety, that a building is safe before it can be reoccupied. So post-fire, I heard from many occupants that they didn't hear alarms. And I also heard from the fire brigade who expressed concern about the state of the emergency pumps. So at the same time, I was receiving multiple calls from a relief centre that we had set up at the town hall, which was housing most of these occupants, about when the building could be reoccupied. So at that point, I concluded that the building was in a state where it couldn't be occupied as it was. So what I decided to do in order to satisfy myself was a comprehensive essential safety measures audit. In order to do this properly, I engaged experts, as you do. I used 10 of my own staff, and I engaged Jonathan Barnett and his team at Basic Expert to assist with a very comprehensive audit. The audit took several days, and I'm now going to talk about what we found. So the first thing that we did was download information from the fire indicator panel, and we put this little spreadsheet together. So what we found, that the sprinkler in apartment 2209 went off at 5:43 a.m. in the morning. So the boxes with the red writing are all GFA sprinkler activation. So the second was 13 minutes later. The third sprinkler head went off 3 minutes after that. The fourth went off 2 minutes after that, but interestingly, it was actually the level below the level of fire origin. So the fire was spreading up and was also spreading down at the same time. And the fifth was 2 minutes after that. The fire brigade arrived at the site 7 minutes after the GFA, and you can see that in the timeline. They were on level 27, above where they thought the fire was, 17 minutes after they arrived on site, which was absolutely incredible. The MFB were unable to use lifts as they didn't operate as they were supposed to. However, they still managed to get to level 27 and stop the fire from progressing any further. Their quick response to the fire stopped it from progressing to the top of the building, remembering there was 41 levels in this building. So essential safety measures. ESMs are critical in ensuring that both people get out of a building safely and that the fire brigade get there quickly and get early warning to a fire. So in order to carry out a full and proper ESM audit, we first had to understand the building, and this is the hardest part. These days, buildings are complex and they are hardly ever DTS. So in order to understand the building's fire systems and how they worked, we first had to understand the fire engineering report for this building. The building was equipped with a specifically designed smoke alarm and detection system, which I'll talk in more detail about later, a corridor pressurization system, an enhanced sprinkler system with 2 sprinkler circuits on each level. We had one for apartment spaces and one for common spaces. Both had flow switches connected back to the FIP. So the FIP knew where a fire was and whether it was in a public space or whether it was in an apartment. We had almost no fire doors, and we had a special fire mode for lifts to assist in the evacuation of occupants. On GFA, the lifts would go to the fire affected floor, then the floor above, then the floor below to assist with the evacuation of the building. Unfortunately, this wasn't operating properly. So this is taken straight out of the FER, and this applies to all doors, including apartments and to the 2 stairs. So we had solid core doors only, not fire doors. They were self-closing. They had to be at least 35 millimetres thick. Door frames had to be at least 25 millimetres thick. The rebate in the door to house, in the frame, sorry, to house the door had to be a minimum of 20 millimetres. The force had to be no more than 110 newtons. Doors had to be maintained in accordance with Part 11 of the building regs, which were the applicable regulations at the time. The building was 11 years old at the time of the fire. Door closures had to be maintained every 6 months. Apartment doors effectively achieved an FRL of -60/30 if they complied with these requirements. So in order to audit the doors, these are the things that we had to look at. We had to check that screws on all 3 hinges were tight. We had to check that pins were all the way in. We had to check that screws on the strike plates were tight. Screws on the faceplate had to also be tight. Door closers had to operate at the correct strength. We needed to measure the door leaf, the rebate, and the door frame itself to make sure that it complied with the FER. So what did we find? We found 300 doors needed adjustment. There were 351 sole occupancy units, and 300 of those doors, and this is just doors to sole occupancy units, needed some adjustment. It was either self-closers, latches, or acoustic seals that were used were sticking and were stopping the door from closing properly. I'm going to talk a little bit about the smoke alarm and detection system now. The building had an AS3786 detector system on AS1670 sounder basis in every living space and every bedroom in the entire building. So on activation of a general fire alarm, when either a sprinkler head or a detector in the corridor or public space, every sounder in every room in every apartment would sound. That was what the design required. This would occur on the fire affected floor, the fire at the floor above and the floor below. And this was to give people that were immediately in danger the earliest possible warning so they could evacuate the building. Smoke alarms acted both as local alarms within each apartment, but also as sounders when a general fire alarm went off. There was also an egress system in the corridor. So this is a really unusual design, and it took us several days to understand how the building worked. There was one way, I guess, information coming from the FIP on activation of GFA, and those smoke alarms within apartments would act as sounders. So what did we find? When we tested all the smoke detectors in SOUs, we found that 66 apartments either had no smoke alarms at all, or the smoke alarms had been covered or somehow or other tampered with. As the building was 11 years old at the time of the fire, the owners corporation thought they were doing the right thing when they advised owners to replace all their detectors because the building was more than 10 years old and those detectors had expired, and they were 3786 detectors. This resulted in smoke alarms being replaced with incompatible alarms, which meant that they failed to operate under general fire alarm because they didn't talk to the FIP properly. So in the end, 600 detectors had to be replaced in this building before it could be reoccupied. We also looked at corridor pressurisation. This was generally in reasonably good condition. We just needed to understand how it worked, and that we didn't have stair pressurisation. The corridor pressurisation acted as both. The doors to the fire isolated stairways had no seals, and the pressurisation from each level actually leaked into the fire isolated stair. So we did a lot of testing, and this is kind of the spreadsheet that we used to capture all that information. So FIP. So we have standard FIP with an alarm signalling unit. And what we found at the base of that were 2 batteries that were expired in 2014, and there was no charge, and they were leaking acid. Pumps, the pump room. So the brigade had some concerns about the pump room. We went into the pump room. What we found is that many gauges were not liquid filled. Pressure switches were sticking. The actual system was pumped up to 2000 kPa, which is well above what it should have been, but this is because all the equipment in the pump room wasn't maintained properly. We had defective pressure relief valves. We had separate pressure relief valves on the diesel pump only. We had no chains around isolation valves, no monitoring of isolation valves of incoming water supply. We had skewed couplings on pipe work, and we had a lack of high pressure fittings as well. AS 1851, this is often a problem that we come across. What do you maintain a building to? Compliance with AS 1851 is not always sufficient. You need to read the FER. Where the FER references, say AS 1851 2005, or another version, that's the version that you need to comply with. AS 1851 2012 is only applicable if the OP requires that. The fire engineer might have relied on a different version based on inspection reliability. Also, annual essential safety measures are just not enough. All too often, they're found to be defective, as we found in this building. So in conclusion, as the MBS, I can't allow a building to be reoccupied unless it's safe for occupation. This event presented me with a rare and unique opportunity, and that is a completely vacant building. In order to get access to all parts of the building, to carry out the audit, I had to issue orders to have all the doors unlocked in the building. That in itself was somewhat controversial at the time. So why were the ESMs in this building in such a state? It wasn't because the owners neglected to maintain the building. They spent more than $30,000 a year on maintenance, and the building actually had an up-to-date annual essential safety measures report stuck up on the wall right next to the FIP. The building was well designed and it was well built. There was a lot of conservatism. The design was conservative and there was lots of redundancy, and that's why no one got hurt despite the lack of maintenance. But how are maintenance contractors meant to know about all these unique features in the building? And that's the question we need to ask ourselves. Fire engineering reports are almost never available to maintenance personnel. but they're also difficult to read for the average person. So I'm not sure even making that available is the answer. So what do we need to put in place so that owners and maintenance contractors understand how their buildings work? I think that is the challenge moving forward, but it's something that we do need to resolve, as others have touched on and will touch on during this presentation. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Stephen. Very interesting presentation and an interesting building. I'd now like to welcome Paul Bailey, General Manager, Building Consulting, Building and Consulting Company Hendry, for our final presentation. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just get my presentation up. Good morning, everybody. So today with my presentation, I'd like to outline how a building surveyor can assist a client with their ESM responsibilities. Certainly it has its challenges, as highlighted with Steve's presentation. So in my presentation, I'll give an overview of the reasons why a private building surveyor may be engaged to assist with the ESMs, and then discuss the various tasks that may need to be undertaken to arrive at a position where the owner is able to sign their annual essential safety measures report and achieve compliance. There are several reasons that a private building surveyor can be engaged to assist with ESMs, and that could be as a result of enforcement action taken by the council, could be as a consequence of the owner acquiring a new asset or a portfolio of buildings, and within the due diligence period they identified that there was potential issues, so they need a review of those buildings and their maintenance and essential reporting requirements undertaken to ensure that they're up to date as the new owner. Consequently, an end of lease negotiations between a tenant and a landlord may require a review either from a tenant's perspective or the landlord's perspective to ensure that whatever their obligations were under the lease were achieved. Insurance companies may require information in relation to ESM maintenance as a result of policy renewals. And alternatively, it could just be a voluntary initiation by the owner of the building to ensure that what they've been doing correctly, or what they've been doing they believe has been done correctly, and they're not out of sync with any contemporary requirements or provisions. So there are various reasons why a consultant building surveyor can be engaged to assist with ESMs. However, there are several challenges when looking at assisting a client, because you cannot have a cookie cutter approach, because each building and site is unique. So importantly, you need to understand the building or the site, which will include aspects such as the age of the building, alterations that have happened over the years, the use, how it's expected to be used, how it is being used, understanding of the occupants in the building. Is it owner occupied? Does it have one tenant? Does it have multiple tenants? Are there subtenants? Because they all play a component in the consideration for assisting the ultimate person with the responsibility being the owner. That will also include understanding lease conditions. The agreements with landlords and tenants can require tenants to undertake certain activities in relation to maintenance of essential safety measures, and it's may or may not be monitored throughout the course of the period of the lease. So it's ensuring that you understand that as well. And then the reason why you've been engaged will influence the methodology of how you address that reason. And obviously, and I'll come to that later, but obviously if it's a consequence of council enforcement action being taken, the solution to that will be different to a client undertaking a voluntary review. As mentioned with the previous speaker with John, the requirements in the regulations to find and locate documents in respect of the site and the building. So those documents can come from various sources, being the owner, tenants, undertaking searches of various authorities such as the council, the Building Appeals Board, Fire Rescue Victoria, CFA, etc. Whole range of documents need to be sourced and reviewed through this process, including occupancy permits, certificates of final inspections, determinations, logbooks, maintenance records, fire engineer reports, Building Appeals Board modifications, alternative, ensuring getting copies of plans for the building and the site so you can understand what's there. Once you've gathered the documentation that you have that's available, the next step is to go to site. And again, as a unique and different, there's no cookie cutter approach to the site inspection. But fundamentally, the purpose of the site inspection is to identify all the essential safety measures that are in the buildings and are on the site. Aspects of the ESMs for site consideration different to the building could be perimeter vehicle access by fire brigade, distance between buildings, clear open space around buildings. So yes, it's a full site analysis, not just looking at buildings. When on site, also need to ensure that you look for any other additional documents and records that may not have been provided. And sometimes the only location for logbooks is on site, and that's ensuring that you look in fire panels. Even some of the occupancy permits and plans that you find on site can be very valuable in achieving the ultimate goal. So it's looking through the site records is important when there as well. Also, with the document review and information you see from owners and tenants, they should have an expectation of how that building and site is to be used and configured. So the site visit, it's also critical to ensure that the use of the building is confirmed as being in accordance with the occupancy permit or the tenancy agreements that are in place. And it's not uncommon for that to be different. So it's something that needs to be worked through. And an important aspect to also identify is what is a tenant's matter or responsibility compared to an owner's responsibility. Sometimes an essential safety measure only occurs in a building as a result of a tenant fit out, and that could be as a result of something to do with a fire engineered solution that requires a feature to be in the building that wasn't there as a base building. So that could be a responsibility only of the tenant to address that matter. There are also tenant installations typically that are not an essential safety measure, and it's important to identify those. Again, a tenant or an insurance company may have a requirement to install a detection system in a building to suit that tenant's needs, which is not a requirement of the building regulations or the BCA or any alternative solution, and therefore it's important to identify that that is not an essential safety measure and doesn't come into play in being listed on a maintenance schedule or an annual essential safety measures report. And it would be expected that when that tenant leaves the building and they put the building back to the way it was before they found it, they will remove that building service, say that detection system, for example, because it's not an essential safety measure and doesn't need to be retained in the base building. So once you've done the documentation review and the site visit, the next step is to ensure that there's an appropriate maintenance schedule in place. So if there is an existing maintenance schedule, that needs to be reviewed to ensure it's correct and accurate. If not, it may mean that a new maintenance schedule needs to be prepared. It's important to remember that the maintenance schedule is a factual document of the findings of the document review and the site investigations. And it needs to be completed correctly, and it needs to be in the form approved and listed on the VBA website and outline the level of performance to be achieved and the various inspection, testing and maintenance requirements that are applicable to each of the essential safety measures that are in the building. Once the the maintenance schedule is identified and determined, then from that you go back over the documentation that you've found in relation to the maintenance and the testing records and the use of the building to ensure that it's all appropriate. Often you'll find that there are shortfalls, whether it's in the maintenance regime or whether it's in the use of the site or the use of the building. And that is where a consultant building surveyor then comes into their own in relation to advising the owner and the tenant on the matters that need to be actioned. If the tenant has created the issue, then the owner may not be aware of it, so they will have to have discussions to work that through. And it may be include the building surveyor so that they can advise clearly what has to happen. As with any gaps between the maintenance schedule and the site and the documentation, a methodology to rectify those gaps needs to be worked through with all relevant parties and agree a timing. Now, if the purpose of the exercise is a result of council enforcement action, then obviously it's important that the council are part of this discussion and that the outcome is acceptable to them. Now, the methodology of rectifying it can sometimes get complex as a result of whether it's a tenant issue to be rectified or a landlord issue to be rectified, and also the timing of that may be challenging. So all parties need to be involved, and it may include the insurance company if that's the trigger as well. At the end of the day, what you want to do is have a maintenance schedule that's complete and accurate. You want to have the gap analysis identified and the works and rectification matters undertaken so that the final step can be realised for the site and the building, and that is the signing of the annual essential safety measures report. However, as previously noted by previous speaker John, is that until all the inspection, testing and maintenance is completed, that report cannot be signed. It may be able to be prepared and drafted and waiting to be signed, and in particularly in a case where a landlord has acquired a new asset and the previous owner hadn't done the required maintenance, the new landlord, the new client, may not be actually able to sign that document for a period of 12 months or whatever time it needs to go by to ensure that at least the required frequency of maintenance is undertaken in the preceding period. Once that's done, and then the owner or their agent can sign it, and they can keep it on records as appropriate. Again, if it was a requirement of council enforcement, then it may be appropriate to provide a copy of that either to the council so that they can address that enforcement requirement, or alternatively, insurance company or any other interested party who has a requirement for that they can be provided that document to satisfy their criteria. Thanks very much, everybody. Appreciate the time.
Thanks very much, Paul, for the presentation, as well as Stephen and John. We'll now open the floor to answer any questions that you have. We've got a number of questions that have come through, so I appreciate that. We'd also like to welcome Peter Jolly, President of the Victorian Municipal Building Surveyors Group, who will be assisting with the question and answers as well. Don't know whether you had... Hello, Peter. Peter, have you had an opportunity to have a look at any of those questions? And
I have.
Yeah, particularly you'd like to address?
Yes, the thing that piques my interest, in fact, is that there's lots of situations where, and it's apparent in some of the questions, lots of situations where a building will comprise multiple occupancy permits and certificates of final inspection, all of which, or most of which, will have ESM maintenance determinations, and they don't necessarily all correlate well, and it's a bit of a administrative nightmare for the owners, corporation managers, the property managers, the people undertaking the ESM maintenance to pull it all together. Now, and I see this all the time at Hume. I'm sure Steve Baxis sees it commonly at Melbourne too. It's a real minefield, and often those maintenance determinations will not necessarily be consistent with in terms of what they contain, and often buildings will have multiple ownerships, common property, etc. My advice to building owners, property managers, owners, corporation managers, there's provisions in the Act to provide for all those maintenance determinations, historical and recent, to be combined. A building surveyor can be engaged, private building surveyor can be engaged to consolidate the ESM list and maintenance determination. The MBS of the local council can do that. There will be a cost involved, but I believe that in the long run, it's more cost effective to do that. It's a bit of a shortcoming in the legislation. I have a view that every time a building permit is issued to alter and extend a building, the maintenance determination should be updated automatically as a matter of course. That's not the case, and so you do get this situation where there's documents, many documents in some larger buildings. And it can be a bit of a administrative minefield and nightmare, in fact. So I recommend that people do that. It's better to combine them all, to consolidate them all as you go. I would also recommend that owners, when they appoint a building surveyor to issue a building permit for alterations and extensions that's going to involve the need for a maintenance determination to be made, they should be asking their RBS to do that consolidation as part of the process. It makes everyone's life easier, particularly owners and owners corporation managers and property managers. So that's the comment I have to offer.
Thanks, Peter. Stephen, you have a question that you'd like to address?
Yeah, look, there seems to be quite a few questions, Andrew, on AS 1851, and there's one here that I've got. Fire engineers nominate a particular fire safety measure that's not included in the regs. Look, the best, I said in my presentation, this is somewhat controversial, and it is, but the best way I can describe it is this. And if I use the example of Neo, it had fire safety features that are not in the BCA. It had lifts that assisted in evacuation. It had hybrid smoke alarm and detection systems in bedrooms. These things are not required in the BCA. However, they are part of a well thought out fire engineering design. So the fire engineer needs to specify what level of maintenance is required, and that needs to be followed for the life of the building. You know, as AS 1851 gets altered, it may water down some of the maintenance requirements, which could have a detrimental effect to the reliability of that ESM in that building, because it's so critical for that design. And AS 1851 doesn't consider all scenarios. It considers, and I guess assumes in a lot of ways, that a building is DTS. So in my view, I think that if a fire engineer specifies a level of maintenance, that's what needs to be followed for the life of the building. And that's the best way I can answer that question, I think.
Thanks, Steve. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Look, I've noticed some questions in relation to responsibility of ESMs, you know, regardless of how an ESM comes about, whether it's a tenant's fit out, it's always an owner's responsibility other than the exits and paths of travel. And that's correct. From a building regulatory side of things, there's no doubt about it. I mean, Steve and Peter can confirm, you know, when they're doing audits of buildings, they're looking at it from a requirement of the owner has to provide the documentation in relation to ESMs, and if any action is taken, it's against the owner. But the responsibility is different to how the owner exercises their agreements with their tenants to ensure that they meet their responsibilities as an owner. And so that's where it gets complicated, as Peter's identified before, is we got buildings with lots of owners, tenants, various tenants, or you may just have one tenant, but there are arrangements in place that the owners put to ensure that the owner meets their responsibilities, and some of those arrangements require the tenants to do certain activities, and that may be ensuring that they maintain the essential safety measure that's as a consequence of their fit out. Certainly doesn't absolve the owner from any responsibility, but it's up to the owner to be prudent in ensuring that they monitor that and they get the relevant evidence from the tenant regularly to ensure that as an owner they can sign off their annual essential safety measures report.
All right, thanks, Paul. John, did you have any questions there you'd like to address?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. There's a few good questions in here. Let me just see if I can share these. The question that one of the questions asked is, do all contractors who inspect and issue annual essential safety measure reports need to use the new template? The annual essential safety measures report is an approved form that forms part of the building regulations. So in answer to that question, you have to use the current edition of the annual essential safety measures report, and that's available on the VBA website under the heading of approved forms. There's a couple of other questions in here that I've got time to go through. There's another question. It's in relation to Regulation 215 maintenance determinations. The question is, can this be listed on the certificate of final inspection, or does it require a separate document? So that's similar to the previous answer. A maintenance determination is an approved form under the building regulations. So the approved form is the document that has to be used. So a separate maintenance determination, which is a different document to a certificate of final inspection, that has to be created by the relevant building surveyor. So another question, let me see. Is it mandatory to display a maintenance schedule and annual essential safety measures report? The current regulations don't require a maintenance schedule or annual essential safety measures report to be displayed. There is a requirement to display occupancy permits, but in its current format, it doesn't extend to the maintenance schedule or annual essential safety measures report. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, John. There are a number of questions there also in regards to registration of contractors and ESM maintenance companies. That is on the radar. So I think there are a number of contractors now that are registered, and there's basically an exercise in play at the moment between DELP and VBA, sort of looking at other contractors. Part of the complication is that obviously with ESMs, it's sort of broader than just the active and passive systems. There's things like signing off on the egress paths, and so we're sort of still contemplating the need for someone to be qualified to be able to do an overarching coordination of all the efforts from an ESM perspective, but that's still being considered. It is a balance between sort of providing too much bureaucracy and paperwork, but also making sure that we've got appropriate skills and abilities in these contractors to be able to efficiently and accurately undertake their services, which I think from a lot of the comments we've had is not occurring on site. Another sort of 5 minutes, so I might sort of try and do another round. And Peter, do you have any more comments or questions there that are still remaining?
I'd like to comment further on what you've just discussed. So it's my experience. We have an ESM maintenance audit program in Hume. We probably are auditing more than 100 buildings a year, usually larger complexes. We find our compliance rate failure is about 95% in Hume. Most owners that we visit, even though we write in advance and the letter explains the obligations and directs people to the VBA website for the annual report documents, and when we get there, most people have no idea of their obligations. A lot of the maintenance contractors involved in this industry operate in their own little niche, so they don't do the overarching full ESM auditing and maintenance and repairs. It might be just an electrician or a plumber who just does a part of the job, and it is very labour intensive for our staff because we've got to take on an educative role, and we end up having to coordinate the whole process to get compliance. So my observation is that there would be much better outcomes, in my view, if there was a registered practitioner class of ESM maintenance compliance coordinator as a licensed person who brings it all together for property owners and owners corporation managers, because it's an area of where technical competencies are necessary, and we don't ask owners to be doing roadworthies on their own car. They go to the roadworthy specialist, don't we? I think the same thing should be the case in terms of ESM maintenance requirements. It would probably be a much more effective, efficient and cost-effective outcome for all. So that's an opinion piece.
No, and I think some good points there, Peter. I think I agree. I think there is a need for more rigour around the process and more control. So I think that's part of the exercise currently. So hopefully we can sort of implement some changes that will start to address some of those issues. Steve, any other?
Yeah, I might expand on what Peter said. I have slightly different observations to Peter, but same outcome. And that's purely because of the building stock in the City of Melbourne. Owners and operators of buildings and managers know of their obligations, and they pay good money to have buildings maintained. But I think the success rate is the same as what Peter experiences. About 95% don't comply. And I think this is a lot to do with the fact that we don't have a minimum benchmark for these people that maintain ESMs. So whether they do or whether they don't, sometimes it's the same outcome. Clearly, it's better that they do maintain or attempt to maintain their ESMs, but without a level playing field as to, or benchmark or minimum training for these personnel, unfortunately, we're getting some really awful outcomes, as we saw in the example that I spoke about today at Neo.
Thanks, Steve. Paul?
Yeah, look, I suppose just on that same point, and there's also a question I want to address as well, but yes, exactly right. I think part of it is just how the building owners, the term for their engagement of their contractors and the scope that they write for their maintenance. It's just that they don't have the ability to understand the full package of bringing it all together. So as Peter pointed out, an overviewing practitioner, and I think at the moment that role is being undertaken in part by a building surveyor to help do that for those owners who realise they are struggling. But I think in a lot of cases there is money spent on maintenance and they just don't realise they're not doing what they're required to do where they believe they think they do. A question that, or a theme of some of the questions that relates to fire engineered solutions and those specific matters that come out of fire engineered performance solutions, about how they need to be captured and whose role is it to ensure that they're captured on the maintenance determination. I think the answer to that is that the relevant building surveyor needs to ensure that when they're approving performance solutions that require unique features or unique maintenance, that they have that clearly understood from the fire engineer, that they articulate what they're required for the basis to support their fire engineer performance solution going forward, and the building surveyor capture that, as well as ensuring that the building owner is aware of those requirements at the time of both the building permit and occupancy permit being issued.
Terrific, thanks, Paul. Sorry, John, I don't have time for you to sort of pass any final comments. We're out of time, but I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance and thank our presenters whose time and effort is much appreciated in furthering the understanding in this important area of building regulation. When we close, a short survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd be grateful if you could take a minute to provide us with your feedback so that we can improve these webinars for the future. This webinar will also be available as a recording, so if you'd like to refer back to it, that link should be made available at some time in the future. Thanks again, and enjoy your afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.